Hi, everyone. My name is Randy Xu with Luohan Academy, and welcome to another latest installment in our Luohan Webinar series. Today, we have the distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Alex Edmans, who is Professor of Finance at London Business School. And then previously, he was tenured Professor of Finance at Wharton. So I think Alex's resume and CV is just too extensive to cover in detail, but I will just say some of the highlights. Alex is a director of the American Finance Association, a fellow of the Financial Management Association. And then for the last 5 years, from 2017 to 2022, he was managing editor of the Review of Finance, which is a leading academic finance journal in Europe. Alex is, his research interests are in corporate finance, responsible business, and behavioral finance. And in particular today, he will be talking about his expertise in these topics, especially responsible business and ESG. So he has extensive research in this space. He's also written a book called Grow the Pie: How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And with his expertise, he has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He's testified in front of the UK Parliament, presented to the World Bank, and given a number of talks, including quite a few popular TED Talks. So we're very, very glad to have Alex with us today to give this presentation, ESG, the beginning, the end, and the future. And the way this will work today is Alex's presentation will take approximately 40 minutes, and we will leave the remainder of the hour for a Q&A for the audience. So with that, I will hand it to Professor Alex Edmans.
Great. Thank you so much, Randy. And it's really nice to be here and get the chance to address this prestigious forum. So as Randy says, I'm going to speak about ESG, the beginning, the end, and the future. And you might think, well, that's a strange title to give a talk. Why should I be thinking about the end of ESG, right? ESG has only just started. ESG now has massive momentum. So why can I talk about the end of something which is perhaps the biggest issue facing business today? Well, before I explain why I'm going to call for the end of ESG, let me first start with the beginning. So why do we even have ESG to begin with? Because ESG is a pretty new thing. So when I started as a professor at Wharton 15 years ago, nobody really cared about ESG. So why is it that ESG has suddenly become a big thing? Well, I think a good place to discuss this is to ask, well, what would a world without ESG look like? Well, a world without ESG is the world of Milton Friedman. So as I'm sure you all know, about 50 years ago, Milton Friedman, one of the greatest economists of all time, wrote a highly cited but also highly controversial article. This was not in an academic journal, it was in the New York Times magazine, and he said that the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. So in a world without ESG, a company has one goal and one goal only: to make as much money as possible. So it's to increase its profits. And what does that mean? Well, they go on to say this means if you focus only on profits, then you must focus totally on making money and forget about any concern for employees, customers, or society. So if this is what a world without ESG looks like, then it seems obvious that we need ESG. But there's one problem with this. Actually, Milton Friedman never said that. So my second quote here is not from Milton Friedman at all. It was from a Forbes article by Steve Denning. So he was writing about Milton Friedman. He was arguing why Milton Friedman is wrong, and he claims that Milton Friedman's article argues for all of these things, but it actually doesn't. And this is not just Steve Denning. If you to look at lots of people who are arguing about Milton Friedman, then this is it's lots of other people who are about Milton Friedman. It's many other people who are arguing this also. So what does Milton Friedman actually say? Well, he says the following. It may well be in the long run interest of a corporation that is a major employer in a small community to devote resources to providing amenities to that community or to improving its government. That may make it easier to attract desirable employees. It may reduce the wage bill. So what Friedman argues is that actually, even if your only goal is to focus on profit, on making as much money as possible, well, you will still invest in ESG. You will still take care about society. Why? Because the only way to make profit, at least in the long term, is if you end up investing in employees and the local community. So this is quite striking. Like, what this suggests is that maybe we don't need ESG at all, right? Because if we focus only on profit, as long as we focus on long-term profit, that will force us to do things that end up being in society's interest. So let's give an example. So let's say you're a car company. Would you invest in electric cars? Well, the answer is yes, because even if I don't care about climate change, I will invest in electric cars. Why? Because if I do a spreadsheet calculation, then I can forecast this will be the profit from investing in electric cars. And if the profit exceeds the cost, then I'm going to go ahead. Now, we know that investing in electric cars is pretty uncertain, but we know how to deal with uncertainty. You do a sensitivity analysis. I can look at an upside case and a downside case, and I will find that the electric car is still positive net present value, so I will still go ahead and invest in the electric cars. So actually, the whole idea of focusing on profit might be good. And indeed, if you learn from basic economics, the whole idea of a profit signal is it forces people to do what the world wants. Why is there so much demand for electric cars nowadays? It's because we understand that climate change is important. There's now many customers wanting to buy electric cars because they care about the climate. So this means that the focus that we typically have on shareholder value, shareholder capitalism, is actually what we want, not what we don't want. If you go to Finance 101, right, this teaches us that shareholder value is an inherently long-term concept. So what do we teach in the very first lecture of any finance class? The price of a company is the expected value of all future cash flows, where the important term here is the infinite. So when you are valuing a project, valuing a stock, you are going to look at all of the future cash flows right until the end of time. And therefore, if this is the case, we should only focus on maximizing market value, not on something like ESG, which will be a distraction. So I think this is really important because many people who criticize finance, who criticize economics, who criticize the current model of capitalism will argue that it's short-termist, when in fact things like stock prices, these are inherently forward-looking. And so this might mean that the solution to many of the problems in the world today might be a focus on more shareholder value rather than less. Now, this might seem a little bit like sacrilege, because nowadays people argue we should move away from shareholder value towards stakeholder value. But in fact, if we understand that shareholder value is long-term profits, we actually want companies to focus more on shareholder value. Maybe some of the problems in the world are companies focusing too much on profits. And if you, instead of focusing on short-term profits, you focused on long-term shareholder value, then we would see the investments in electric cars, we would see the investments in carbon capture that we would like to. So how can it be that I am often known as an ESG advocate when I recognize that the non-ESG position of Friedman is much more nuanced than often thought? Well, this is for a couple of reasons. Number one is that ESG may have a useful informational role, in that this equation here doesn't really govern an executive's daily decisions. when she goes to the office, she doesn't think about solving this particular equation. And in particular, she might not realize that certain ESG factors might improve long-term cash flow. So to give you an example, let me go to the first ever job I had after university before I became an academic. This was my job. So I worked at Morgan Stanley in London. And this is a picture of my old desk. And as you can see from the microwavable ready meals in the bottom, I was a junior analyst, right? I started right at the bottom. I had to work all the time. And this is why I couldn't actually have a proper meal. I always had to eat at my desk. And this is indeed what people thought as being the best way to maximize profits at Morgan Stanley or any investment bank. In order to do this, let's actually have a low ESG. Let's try to squeeze as much out of employees as possible. Now, to me, I didn't think that this was the best way of motivating people. And during my time at Morgan Stanley, there were people who treated me really well. And even though that might seem counterintuitive, that was the best way to motivate me and to encourage me to go above and beyond rather than the carrot and stick. And so when I got to MIT and did my research, one paper that I wrote during the final year there was this paper on the importance of employee satisfaction. That actually companies who treat their workers well deliver long-term value that beats their peers by shareholder return. And so this is something you might think, well, isn't this obvious? Why did I need to write a paper showing that treating employees better leads to your company performing better? But it's because it's not obvious. Many people might think that treating your workers well is costly, and the best way to get the most as possible out of them is to force them to always have dinner at their desk. So this is what I mean by the informational role of ESG. We might not understand that things such as treating employees well are important. If somebody saw the referee report that I very carelessly showed earlier, that was about a paper on diversity and equity inclusion. And until recently, maybe people did not understand the importance of diversity. Okay, so there's a second reason why we actually might care about ESG, which is a practical. So the informational role is that ESG alerts us to the fact that ESG actually improves long-term returns. But there's also a useful practical role, which is the fact that shareholder value is best pursued not directly, but as a byproduct of ESG. So what do I mean by this? This is quite difficult to parse. So what does this actually mean? Well, I think the best way to explain what I mean by this is just to give you an example. So let me take you on a little bit of a journey back to 2003. So 20 years ago, before we even had this ESG movement. And so Vodafone, which is a UK telecoms company, they noticed that in Kenya, citizens were using their phone to transfer mobile minutes to each other as a form of currency. So this gave them an idea. They asked, what if we could develop a technology that allows people to transfer not mobile minutes, but actual cash? So at the time, 50 million Kenyan adults had no access to banking. They had to rely on cash, which could be forged or lost or stolen. So if they could make it pay off, the social impact would be huge. And indeed, 4 years later, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service, which allows people to transfer money from phone to phone just as easily as you could send a text message nowadays. So that's something which transformed people's lives. So within the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, this lifted 200,000 people out of poverty. And many of these households are headed up by women. It allows them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there's now a large effect on gender equality. But the nice coda to this story is that even though Vodafone launched M-Pesa to solve this social problem of financial inclusion in Kenya, ultimately, Vodafone was able to monetize it because it now charges a small percentage of every transaction as a fee. So this is an example of a decision made on ESG grounds in order to serve wider society. But ultimately it led to profit, which is why I said earlier that maybe profit or shareholder value is not something best pursued directly. So let me just drill down on this. So if you indeed use a net present value calculation to try to justify Vodafone launching M-Pesa, you would have never been able to get this through an NPV analysis. What are the future cash flows of launching M-Pesa? Probably hugely negative, right? So nobody had pulled off before the idea of mobile money, so there'd be a huge amount of investment, and it probably would fail. And even if it worked, well, there could be reputational risk because maybe people would end up using mobile money for money laundering. And even if they avoided that problem, where would the money be made? Out of serving some of the poorest people in the world. So you don't even have a midpoint about which to do a net present value analysis. So with electric cars, there's risk there, but again, we know how to deal with risk. We have a midpoint, and then we can do a sensitivity analysis. But with something like M-Pesa, it's not risk, but it's uncertainty. So many economists will know the difference. With risk, you at least know the parameters. With uncertainty, you don't even know the parameters. And just even stepping away from economics, as Donald Rumsfeld argued, you have known unknowns where there are certain risks, but at least we know the parameters, or there are unknown unknowns. There is no way of predicting whether you'll be able to monetize. And so this is the power of ESG. This is how somebody like me, an ex-investment banker and a professor of finance, rather than philosophy or business ethics, can be so positive about ESG because it has a strong business and commercial case, not just because it's fluffy and serves wider society. So the power of ESG is that it frees us from having to justify every decision with a financial calculation. And that financial calculation is problematic because it's limited. There's so many decisions that we cannot justify with a spreadsheet. Beyond the M-Pesa example, if you were to give, say, more parental leave at work, well, parental leave is costing a lot of money. If you were to do this, how would you see how many workers will be more motivated? How much money will they more make for you? You don't even have a midpoint about which to conduct a sensitivity analysis. And stepping away from business, let's think about the decisions you make in your general life. So I don't know what your objective of life is. Obviously, it's not for me to say what the meaning of life should be, but let's say your meaning of life is happiness. Would you then take every decision by asking, is this going to make me happy? Well, if I did that, if I tried to pursue happiness directly, I would probably do things like drink a lot, eat a lot, act very selfishly. But if instead I had a different objective, which is to be a great colleague, a great researcher, a great teacher and husband and father and son, well, then maybe in the long term, that would lead me to being more happy. So just like happiness is not something we pursue directly, something like shareholder value might not be pursued directly either, but it's as a byproduct of serving wider society, because then it frees you to making all of these other decisions. And so this is why I believe we have a very convincing argument for ESG. So in the book that Randy kindly mentioned, I view the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And we can split the pie between investors in the form of profits, that's the blue, and society in the form of fair wages to workers, fair prices to customers, fair taxes, and that's the orange. And often we think that the best way to increase the blue, to make more money, is to split the pie differently, is to take from other people. And so that's what we saw at Morgan Stanley, try to work your employees as hard as possible to squeeze that little bit extra out of them. But in the long term, the pie might actually shrink and therefore profits shrink because employees get demotivated, they leave, they walk away. So instead, what I'm arguing is that maybe ESG is a way of growing the pie. So just like a person who goes around thinking, how do I become a better parent or husband or son or colleague, might become happy in the long term, a company which has this mission to try to serve society, you might come up with these great ideas like M-Pesa. You come up with these ideas to serve society to increase the orange, but as a result of serving society, ultimately you become better off and therefore the blue increases. So let's say you agree with everything I've said, that there is now a good business case for ESG. Let's do ESG because it inspires us to create shareholder value. Why is it that a recent paper that I wrote is now called The End of ESG? Well, what I've argued is that the main motivation for ESG is to create long-term value. And so what that means is that ESG should be seen as mainstream rather than niche. So when I'm talking about the end of ESG, I'm not saying ESG should end in terms of a concept, an idea. I'm saying ESG should end in terms of a term. Because the problem with this phrase ESG is it seems niche and it seems specialist. It is associated with maybe only Democrats or left-wing people should care about ESG, but right-wing people should not. And this is why we have the polarization in the US. Or similarly within a company, you might think, well, ESG should just be left to the head of ESG. And then normal business people like the CEO and the CFO should not care about it. But if indeed the motivation for ESG is not to serve society, but to deliver higher long-term shareholder value, then it's extremely important and it should be something considered by everybody. So considering these long-term factors when you analyze a company, such as employee satisfaction, this is not ESG investing, it is investing. So for 7.5 years, I've served on the Responsible Investment Advisory Committee of Royal London, a large UK asset manager. Who comes to our meetings? It's not just the head of responsible business and the head of sustainable investing. Our chief investment officer comes to every meeting. Why? Because he's responsible for tons of funds, many of which don't have an ESG label. But if indeed the discussions we will have will be about creating long-term value, then this is relevant for every single one. So I don't even think there's such a thing as ESG investing. It's ESG analysis. It's about how do we incorporate ESG criteria into our analysis of long-term decisions. So this is why I'm calling for the end of ESG. This should be seen as mainstream. But there's a flip side to it, is not only am I arguing that ESG is extremely important, it should not be seen as niche, also ESG is nothing special. So what do I mean by this? Now that there's so much excitement about ESG, it is put on a pedestal. So if you are a company and you teach and you improve your ESG by donating lots to charity or reducing your carbon footprint, you will get more brownie points on that than if you were to increase innovation or increase productivity. If you're an investor and you engage with companies to increase their diversity, you're going to get lots of great public relations over and above engaging with companies to allocate their capital better. And then just to my profession, if you are a professor and you add more ESG content to your courses, you're going to get more brownie points than if you were just to improve the quality of your teaching or improve the scientific rigor. And so why do I want to highlight this? Is that yes, ESG is a way of creating long-term value, but there's so many other ways of creating long-term value that don't fall within this ESG label. great capital allocation, productivity, innovation, brand strength, employee engagement, succession planning. All these things are great for a company's long-term value. Just like as a professor, how might I better teach my students? By challenging them, by teaching critical thinking, by making sure my lectures have academic research rather than fluff. All of these things matter, not just ESG content. And so this is what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of my 15 or so minutes, is why ESG should not be prioritized over other dimensions of long-term value. And this is why I'm calling for an. So how the rest of the 15 minutes will go is I'm going to revisit how we view a number of important business issues when we look at them through a long-term value lens rather than an ESG lens. And what do I mean by a long-term value lens? I'm going to look at these issues according to whether or not they create long-term value, rather than whether or not they fall within this ESG bucket. Okay, so the first one is ESG engagement. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're an investor and you engage with the company to increase the wages to workers, to reduce their carbon footprint, you are going to get great media coverage. But what is the goal of engagement? The goal of engaging with a company is to create great companies. We want great companies, not just companies that are great at ESG. And a great company might excel in many non-ESG dimensions. It just could be ruthlessly effective, extremely efficient, highly productive, and so forth. So rather than labeling engagements according to ESG versus non-ESG, what matters is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? So there's now shareholder proposals, and often shareholders will say, well, we're going to support ESG proposals, but not financial proposals. But this is crazy. There could be ESG proposals on things which are immaterial to long-term value, and there could be financial proposals which are not just good for long-term financial value, but good for wider society. If you improve productivity, then you're reducing resource usage. And there's a series of great academic papers by Alon Brava at Duke, Wei Zhang, who at the time was at Columbia, now is at Emory, and their various co-authors, showing that hedge fund activism, which is non-ESG engagement, it's motivated purely by financial value, does lead to not only shareholder value, but also stakeholder value. As I mentioned earlier, if you're making the company more efficient, more innovative, then it's creating more value for wider society. But when you look at engagement by an ESG investor, here the evidence is rather mixed. Yes, if the engagement is by a large investor who probably has financial as well as ESG motives, then ESG engagement does improve long-term value. But if you're a gadfly investor, which is an investor who has stakes in loads and loads of companies and is trying to push your one hot button issue to as many companies as possible, then maybe you're actually destroying value. Indeed, this is what the evidence suggests. Engagement by non-ESG investors improves value, but ESG engagement by gadflies, that reduces value because they have other types of motive. Okay, so the second issue I'm going to address is ESG metrics. So nowadays we have policymakers, standard-setting bodies, investors demanding that companies report as many ESG metrics as possible to hold a company to account for its ESG. However, when we look at this through a long-term value lens, we don't want to hold the company to account for its ESG. We want to hold a company to account for creating long-term value. And there's many things which create long-term value which don't fall under the ESG umbrella. And indeed, 30 years ago, we had this idea of the balanced scorecard, and that's always highlighted to us that the long-term value of a company depends on a balance of financial and non-financial factors. So they said, look at things like employee engagement, customer net promoter score, number of new patents, and so on. Those are key performance indicators, and a key performance indicator is something which is relative to future performance. Whereas nowadays, ESG metrics are reported even if they're not relevant for performance. For example, in a tech company, do we really care about your carbon footprint? Probably not, because you don't really have an important effect on carbon because you're in a tech company. Another problem with ESG metrics is that they are often about doing no harm and ensuring that you split the pie fair. So these ESG metrics might be carbon emissions, water usage, workplace injuries. Now, those are not bad, like we don't want to injure our workers and we don't want to pollute the environment. But a lot of value creation, in my view, is about actively doing good, growing the pie, rather than just doing no harm. So when Vodafone does something like launch M-Pesa, that does not reduce its water usage. It does not reduce its carbon footprint. Instead, it positively creates value for wider society. And so we view these metrics through a long-term value lens, not an ESG lens. It's much more freeing because then we ask ourselves, well, what are the important dimensions which measure whether my company is creating long-term value? I don't care whether they're called ESG or not. Some things might be ESG, but some things might not be. And indeed, one example could be the number of people that you lift out of poverty, which is something that Vodafone used. Okay, the third issue I'm going to talk about is ESG fund regulation. So regulators are quite reasonably cracking down on greenwashing, which I'm sure most people know, but greenwashing is the idea of saying something, but actually not putting it into practice. So you might claim to be a green responsible fund, but then if you hold 30 brown stocks, maybe people would argue that you are not doing what you said. Now, maybe once you think that clients of these funds should be protected, but greenwashing is an issue for any thematic fund. So let's say you're a value fund. A value fund invests in companies which are good value. Well, what happens if you're a value fund and you end up underperforming because you invested in companies that were actually bad value? Well, you probably should be held up for greenwashing, but right now nobody cares. Right? Regulators only care about ESG funds that hold brown companies or vote against shareholder proposals, when if you're a value fund and you invest in funds that are bad value, there's no regulatory action. What about if you're a growth fund and you invest in companies that actually don't have growth prospects? If you're the Capital Group New World Fund, are you truly investing in frontier economies? If you're the Jupiter Global Financial Innovation Fund, are you investing in a fund which is financially innovative? And maybe it's not just thematic funds. Any actively managed fund claims they will beat the market in their prospectus. But if you're an actively managed fund and you underperform the market 5 years in a row, you would not suffer any regulatory action whatsoever. Whereas if you claim to be a green fund and you hold brown stocks, you might be in trouble. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't police greenwashing, but if we want to police greenwashing by ESG funds, we also should police misleading claims by any type of fund, because anybody who invests in a fund deserves protection, regardless of whether it's an ESG fund or not. Just because you are not an ESG fund does not get your fee. And ultimately, another problem with ESG is that, as I mentioned earlier, it is politicized. So people talk about ESG believers and ESG deniers. Why? Because the phrase is something which invites political reactions to. So when there were some arguments which were attacking ESG by the likes of Tariq Fancy, there were people who responded to this and said, it's complete BS. Let's cut through the nonsense around ESG, which is just unprofessional. So I myself don't agree with everything that Tariq Fancy wrote. I wrote a response to him on Medium called, Is Sustainable Investing Really a Dangerous Placebo? But rather than calling the other side BS, maybe the first thing you should do is to try to understand the other side and to see whether actually there might be some good points to what he's making. A leading practitioner wrote to me on LinkedIn, Hi Alex, you want to fight? Me and Aswath Damodaran are about to get in a boxing match about his ESG takedown piece. Please consider co-writing a counterpoint op-ed with me. Now, apologies if you already know him, but Aswath Damodaran is known as the Dean of Valuation. He's one of the best, or perhaps the best known teacher of finance in the world. And if indeed the Dean of Valuation has some concerns about ESG, my reaction is not to fight him, my reaction is to learn from him. Maybe I might end up disagreeing with him, but before actually saying I want to fight, let me read his article first. But if his article is labeled as an anti-ESG article, then any ESG advocate will either refuse to read it, or you read it with a closed mind, trying to take it apart. And it's not just practitioners who say these things. Sadly, academics do this as well. So one academic who I really respect, I've quoted his work many times, he's written many articles about ESG, which refers to ESG Taliban and ESG flat earthers. So these are people who raise skepticism about the ESG. Now, the Taliban, this is a hugely murderous organization which has killed lots of people. And I think to call people who make anti-ESG arguments the Taliban, this is hugely disrespectful to, unfortunately, the people who've suffered at the hands of the Taliban. And it's also disrespectful to the people that you're arguing against, calling them something like this when they're just raising a different opinion. He wrote articles referring to ESG haters, or a tutorial on ESG investing for Mr. Pence and his friends. Well, this is a terrible article to write. Why? Because this means that ESG is no longer an issue of the evidence, it's now an issue of ideology. So if ESG is seen as something that Republicans should oppose, then let's say you are a Republican, well then when you look at the evidence or read the article, you're now going to read it with a closed mind because you now think, well, as a true Republican, I should be anti-ESG. But if we stop thinking about ESG and start thinking about long-term value, well, then now this is something that Republicans should wholly embrace because they are all about creating successful companies which increase long-term value. Okay, so let me just skip this to make sure that I have room for time because I'd love to hear your questions. And before that, let me address one final thing, which is the elephant in the room. So all my arguments so far have been about financial value. So I said ESG should not be niche. If it creates financial value, everybody should support it, even people who don't have ESG in their title. But I also said if ESG also creates financial value, then it's not better than anything else that creates financial value. But my talk so far up to now has only been about financial value. Isn't there another reason for ESG, which is social value? We do ESG not just to make money, but to save society, to improve the planet, to treat people better. And is this the elephant in the room that I've completely ignored as being a narrow finance first? However, ESG is not unique about creating substantial value. Any intangible asset has substantial externalities. Right, to have a great, efficient company which innovates, makes great products, has great customer service, this is not necessarily ESG, but has a huge positive impact on the environment. What is the best way that I, as a finance professor, might serve society? It is not the fact that I take public transport to my lectures rather than driving, but by preparing my lectures really well and delivering them well, that will hopefully improve my students' human capital and create a positive externality. You can also create negative externalities through non-ESG factors. Negative externalities don't just come from polluting the environment or using water. If you're just a bad company, there's huge negative externalities. So when Kodak missed the digital revolution and failed to move from normal cameras to digital cameras, this led to 150,000 employees losing their job. It led to $31 billion of shareholder value being destroyed. That had a hugely negative societal impact. That's not bad ESG, but that doesn't get away from the fact that it is bad. So the idea that we do care about wider society, not just making money, I agree with this, But I would also say that intangible assets also have these externalities. So let me just end with the future, and then we'll go to Q&A. So what do I hope to be the future of ESG is that it's now seen as mainstream. This is why I said earlier, ESG is extremely important to everybody, relevant to all executives and investors, not just people with ESG in their job title, or political persuasions. If it's something that creates long-term value, then Republicans should embrace it as enthusiastically as Democrats, and all generations. People say now older people are anti-ESG, young people are pro-ESG, but again, creating value is something that both generations should want. But also, it should be something which is analysed with rigorous economic principles, not just gut feel. And here's a recent practitioner paper that I wrote about this, which argues that if ESG is nothing special, we can analyse it with tried and tested economics. There's lots of great economics research on externalities. There's lots of great economics research on how to create long-term value, highlighting how even basic finance principles give a big green light to ESG because they're all about long-term. And finally, what I think the future should also involve is something where expertise is needed and respected. So ESG should be seen as mainstream, but it is also still something which does require expertise. So things like climate change, that should be an issue for science. Some scientists will know that much more than finance professors like me. But now that everybody has jumped on the ESG bandwagon, everybody is supposed to say something about ESG, even if you don't really have expertise. As a finance professor, you're supposed to have ESG content in your class, even if your expertise might be in macro asset pricing. So this is something, yes, it should be mainstream, but just because it's mainstream, it doesn't mean that everybody should speak out about it. It's relevant to everybody, but it doesn't mean that everybody has expertise, just like finance is relevant to every company. But if you're a marketing professor, you shouldn't start teaching about finance. Okay, and so this is the book that was referred to earlier. It's recently come out in Chinese as well. Under the Chinese translation is grow the cake, because I understand that that is the better way of using expression in Chinese. So this is available in both languages. But let me just stop now, reiterate my thanks to everybody for the invitation, and shall I hand back to Randy or Sangwoo for the questions?
Hi. Well, thank you so much for that really informative presentation. I am now asking everyone that if you do have some questions, please raise your hand and we'll call on you since we have a full house. Maybe I'll just start. Usually it's nice for the host to start with one. So if I take what you say, it seems like you're saying we should be more situational, more contextual. Maybe we should be less, I think you used the term monotonic, about thinking about ESG and the metrics. But could you make a case that maybe in some of the metrics they get very muddled once you get into very complicated or very contextual issues, but maybe some sets of metrics, core metrics, maybe should be very simple? Like, for example, if society decides, climate change is very, very important, maybe for some of these metrics or some of these targets, like carbon, we should just have very simple kind of rules and metrics.
I think that's a very fair question, Randy. So there's certain metrics where measurement might not be an issue, where there's a relatively easy way to measure something like carbon footprint, and there's the different scopes of this. But still, my concern about this is that if you just use that information in isolation, that could never be bad, right? More information should always be better than less because you have free disposal. You could just ignore the information you wanted to. But this is actually not true in reality, because what we might do is you might skew ourselves to focusing on what can be measured at the expense of what can't. So this is one of the concerns that people have with earnings per share. So now that companies report earnings per share, it may well be that investors will evaluate a company by looking at the earnings per share, even if there were other relevant dimensions of performance, such as innovation. Just because something is salient and quantifiable and comparable, it will naturally get more attention. We see this in my profession of teaching, let's say even secondary school teaching. If schools release their test scores, then parents will choose schools based on test scores rather than any dimensions of learning. So whenever you have certain things which are measurable and ones that are not, then there's a famous paper by Bengt Holmström and Paul Milgram, who both won the Nobel Prize in economics, showing that you will focus your attention on what can be quantified, not what's non-quantifiable. And given that ESG is so multifaceted and it comprises so many different issues, my concern is that we might focus too much on the quantitative stuff at the expense of qualitative.
Understood. So for the audience, feel free to also unmute and just ask your question directly if you have questions.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I have a question. So I think one of your, if I understood correctly, I think one of your point is, so we have to, if the company just, if we let company pursue the long-term value instead of the just short-term, maybe some of the firms, we don't have to focus too much on the ESG. Is it like a right understanding of your point?
This is correct, because like if we have so much a focus on ESG, companies will focus on increasing the ESG issues, even if there were other issues which were relevant to improving long-term value, such as say productivity or innovation.
So I'm not that familiar with the finance literature, but from, if I understood correctly, there is a lot of the suggestion how to the regulate these companies to focus on the long-term value, for example, like a stock option, those kind of stuff. Yeah. So what you're saying is, so we don't have to maybe focus too much on those, like try to regulate just for ESG, because we already have those other developed mechanisms to regulate. So forcing firms to look pursuing the long-term value. But just like Randy asked you before, some of the metrics, some of the things, just like I think the obvious example is like a climate change, net zero. So just like you said, other good long-term values, even if the companies will pursue like a good long-term value, maybe like a socially valuable long-term value, they might not pursue to reduce carbon, right? For example, the oil companies, maybe they are creating value for society for sure, but they might actually increase their carbon emission. So in that case, how should we understand it? Do we have to, in that case, do we have to make another maybe restriction just for carbon net zero? Or what do you think?
Again, great questions. What do I think? I often like not to say what I think, because my opinion doesn't really matter. What I like to say is, well, what does the evidence show? So hopefully I'm going to share something correctly this time. So you should be seeing a blog article about long-term executive incentives. So this is a paper not written by me, by Caroline Flammer and Tima Bansal. And so what they look at is what happens when you give long-term incentives to executives, not ESG incentives. So these are incentives based on the long-term stock price. And then what's interesting is that even though these are long-term financial incentives, it ends up creating stakeholder value. So not only does innovation go up, but various CSR measures go up. Why? Because if I know that I'm paid according to my stock price in 5 or 7 years' time, I better treat my employees well, otherwise they'll leave. I better reduce my environmental impact, otherwise I might suffer a big customer boycott. If you contrast this with the current emphasis on ESG linked pay, well, the problem with that is that I might focus only on the ESG dimensions which are in the contract. For example, if I go to, say, diversity, I could pay the CEO according to diversity statistics, but then the CEO might only hire females or ethnic minorities when there's many other aspects of diversity, such as socio-economic diversity and so on. And indeed, another paper by Caroline Flammer, actually, which I'm on as well, finds that true diversity, equity, and inclusion has little correlation with hard diversity statistics. So you're right that it sort of seems intuitive that if you want to get something, you pay for it. But if what we want is long-term value, then we should pay according to long-term value. If what we want is ESG, well, we would like to pay for ESG, but we can't because many important dimensions of ESG are not quantifiable. Now, back to one of the concerns that you raised, Samu. Well, if you pay a CEO according to long-term value, will she focus only on the issues that improve long-term value and not carbon? The answer is yes. But I don't think that's a problem, because this means that for a particular company, you think about what are the most relevant issues for you creating long-term value. And maybe if you're a tech firm, it's not my carbon, it's cybersecurity, it's misinformation, it's cyberbullying. And then for an energy company, absolutely, it will be carbon because that's something material to you. So the nice thing about long-term value is that this allows you to choose what is most important to you in terms of creating long-term value. Just like I know there's many academics on this webinar, which I really appreciate. If the goal is, say, to get tenure, you need to make a big impact in the world, or sorry, the big impact on academia. That will be different from different people, right? So maybe for theorists, you might have only a couple of papers, but they're really well done and really deep. Maybe for an empiricist, maybe citations might matter more, or coming up with a big new data set or measure or technique and so on. But this allows people to focus on the dimensions that matter to them rather than just speaking specific targets. Finally, if the reason why we want to get everybody to focus on carbon is not because it matters to long-term value, but because there's a social dimension to it, well, then the solution to this should not be ESG-linked pay, but it should be government regulation. Because if indeed the way that if carbon affects wider society, but it is immaterial for company performance, then we can't really rely on directors to put in carbon-linked pay. What is their incentive to do that if it's not material for financial performance? Whenever we have an externality, the best way to address this externality is through government regulation rather than leaving it to companies. Because if it's left to a company, they should only focus on things which are financially material for them.
Great. And just a reminder that if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask. So you answered my question I wanted to ask, which is it does seem like that leaves a heavy component for society as a whole, mostly through government, maybe through other means, because there's this view that ESG is a hybrid means. It's one of the other means, right?
Mm-hmm. And so, and I think the idea that I'm leaving it to government, you might be skeptical about this because not every government is perfect. I think you're based in the US, Randy, and I'm the UK, and I think neither country can claim to have the most well-functioning government here. And I think governments do fail, which is fair. But I think before taking an issue into your own hands, a good starting point to ask is, has the government failed? Because there's certain things which the government does pretty well. So let's give an example. So last year, there was a campaign by some shareholders to force Sainsbury's, which is a supermarket, to pay the living wage. So what is the living wage? Well, let me first highlight that there's a government regulation on wages, which is called the minimum wage, which is not the living wage. The minimum wage is what the government sets in order to ensure that all employees have enough money to have a dignified life. Now, the living wage is a voluntary wage set by a third party, a non-profit, who argues, well, companies should pay more than the minimum wage, they should pay this thing called the living wage. And they argue they should do this because, we have a responsibility to do really good things for our employees. Now, I don't think that companies should do that. Why? Yes, we should treat our workers well. My paper was employee satisfaction. I understand we need to treat employees well, but this is something that the government does deal with. They set a minimum wage, and that minimum wage is not just set by plucking a number out of thin air. There is an organization called the Low Pay Commission within the government, which looks at things like the cost of living, it looks at things like affordability, and it comes up with this wage. So given that the government can regulate this, and is doing well at regulating it, I don't think that companies have a responsibility to go above and beyond. They now could choose to do that if they think it's useful for motivational reasons, but I don't think they have any moral or ethical argument for doing it. Let me contrast that with, let's say, tobacco. So tobacco is something where one could argue, given that tobacco is legal, then it's fine to have a tobacco company as long as you pay your tobacco taxes. However, one might argue that the government hasn't dealt with this because of lobbying. So the first evidence about smoking causes cancer was found in 1950. And so for 73 years since then, we've known that smoking causes harm, but because of potential lobbying by the tobacco industry, no government has wanted to completely ban it. Therefore, it could be reasonable for an ESG investor to say, I'm never going to invest in tobacco, irrespective of the financial profits from this, because it's just ethically wrong. But remember, the starting point is, do we think the government has dealt with it correctly? And I would say yes for minimum wages, but no for tobacco. And so that's why we start with that before deciding whether or not to take matters into our own hands.
Hi, Alex. This is Wei from the Luohan Academy. Very systematic, and I, agree with most of what you say, especially at the end when you say recognition of trade-offs. And you did mention that this long-term and short-term. In my view, because I was in academic, but now with the academy and doing ESG with Alibaba. So it's about how we do it in practice. How do we operationalize a lot of these principles that you have? And especially you recognize there are government regulations, there are ESG for finance. There are several trade-offs. When you say long term, how long? Because it really matters. It's not easy to get the right length of that long term estimated to in your in decision making, and that's a long short term trade-off. And there are intangibles that you mentioned. I assume it could include culture, corporate culture, your innovation capacity, others, and diversity. And many of those are included now in ESG in some way. But there's also another trade-offs, like trade-offs between these intangibles or maybe ESGs, and that would to some extent make me think that's kind of probably related to materiality assessment that we need to and also externalities that you say, because there might be negative externalities that used to be neglected or positive ones that were underestimated. So trade-offs. So any suggestions or whether you have any observations on how do we operationalize these principles that you have in companies nowadays, long-term, short-term, in between different kind of ESG topics, because ESG is such a mix.
Okay, thanks. Again, great set of questions. So I know they asked one particular question there, but in passing, you said something which was correct and also very interesting, is that these things like Net Promoter Score, employee engagement, they're now counted as ESG. So if the ESG people want to include anything that is value relevant within ESG. So let me just share with you another slide. Again, hopefully I get this right, but this is from the UNPRI's guide to ESG investing. And they say investors adjust the discount rate to reflect ESG factors: operational management, general quality of management, strategic decision making. That is not ESG, but that is just good management. You can't claim that ESG pays off by taking anything relevant for ESG and calling it ESG. These are not ESG factors. So you're absolutely right, Wei, when you ask that. Now, to the substance of your question, trade-offs, and this is really important because many people say, oh, as a company, you should do the right thing, serve everybody in wider society, but there are trade-offs. If I'm an energy company and I shut down a polluting plant, that's great for the environment, but that's bad for workers. So what I think about in terms of trade-offs is I think about comparative advantage. And again, this is not just me thinking, but comparative advantage is an established principle within economics. We have loads of problems in the world. We have 17 sustainable development goals. But I don't think it's a company's responsibility to address all 17 SDGs. So maybe you should focus on the ones that you are best placed to solve. So maybe for Alibaba, this might be to make products available at low cost to people who otherwise might not be able to afford them, to maybe to allow the many to have what historically the few had. Maybe something like life below oceans or circular cities might be something which is beyond your remit. Similarly, for me as a finance professor, I have no knowledge about fintech or artificial intelligence. Those are useful things later, but I am not the only professor at London Business School. I've got lots of my colleagues who are willing to teach those issues. So I think what we should start with, and when we think about these trade-offs, is, well, what are the issues that I have most expertise in? So if somebody saw that embarrassing Russell report that I showed up, that was about diversity. Now, when George Floyd was murdered in the US, people started giving money to Black Lives Matter. Now, clearly, as an ethnic minority, I care about the importance of racial equality. However, if you are, let's say, a pharmaceuticals company, do you really have comparative advantage in knowing that Black Lives Matter is a better charity than, say, Doctors Without Borders? No. Your expertise as a pharmaceuticals company is designing drugs to treat severe illnesses, and it's not to know which charities to support. So often people pursue ESG in a way that's divorced from comparative advantage and expertise. And I think whenever there is a trade-off, to think about, well, if I'm using my limited time and resources to something I have expertise in, well, then for the pharmaceutical company, don't donate to charity, maybe reinvest it in drug development.
Great, Alex. Just a follow-up question is that, what then, would it be inconsistent with, the financial return, that you mentioned, right? Because I apply my best capacity in solving one social challenge, and
Yes.
does that always bring, like in a faster speed, the financial return? There got to be some mismatch here.
Yes. You're absolutely right. There will be a trade-off. And I'd say that this trade-off just applies to everything, not just ESG factors. So this was one of the points about this new article, applying economics, not gut feel, to ESG. I'm arguing that ESG issues are just like any other economics issues, and any issue has diminishing returns. So let's think about a non-ESG issue. How large do I make my factory, or how much do I invest in product quality? After a point, there will be a trade-off. As I invest excessively in quality, then I'm spending too much money and I'm not actually getting the benefit in terms of higher revenues. So yes, a trade-off is tricky. I absolutely agree with you for ESG factors, but there's trade-offs in any business decision. So just like any good executive will understand the trade-offs inherent in building a larger plant or a smaller plant, similarly, you should think about these in terms of the trade-off of being even more friendly towards your employees or less. There will be some financial costs of this, and you don't want to always have more is better, which is again why I'm a bit skeptical about this obsession with metrics. The use of ESG metrics seems to suggest the higher rating you have is better, when actually maybe you had such a high rating because you were over-investing.
Okay,
Thank you.
And then speaking of trade-offs and constraints, we're hitting up constraints on time. So I think we can take one more question and then we'll do a wrap from there.
I have a question here, Parikshit here.
Hi,
thank you, Alex, for the excellent presentation. One is, I want to understand from a geographic lens point of view, that is from a developed versus developing world, right? The global north and the global south. ESG is one size fits all as of now, if you see the way it is practiced. And you talk about in your paper about it is the same old investing term. It is more of analysis and it is moving to mainstream, right? So don't companies or regulators or investors or consumers need to understand the growth trajectory and history of the countries in which these organizations operate, rather than apply a US principle or a EU carbon tax principle just to developing countries? What are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree with everything that you said, Richard. I think this is very important, right? So what is ESG all about? It's about creating value, and creating value means that you need to respond to the needs of a particular region. And these are not one size fits all. So the challenges faced in the US might be different to challenges in the rest of the world. And if the US imposes their belief system on the rest of the world, I think this is wrong. So recently, Royal London, we looked at investing in I think it was a Chinese pork producer. And this pork producer did not have the same animal welfare standards that we would expect if we were to invest in a UK pork producer. Yet we thought, well, actually, the challenges in China might be different in the UK. You have a very large population, maybe with not access to an affordable source of protein. Maybe protein is a delicacy, is a luxury, and many people might just be eating rice or other carb products most of the time. Actually, to have an affordable source of protein for nutrition of humans, this is actually even more important in China than, say, in the US, when the problem in the US might be the opposite, people having too many calories rather than too few. So actually, we could not apply US standards to China. Actually, what really matters in different countries depends on the needs of that particular country. And again, this is, to me, why I don't like these metrics-driven approaches, because that might say, okay, we're looking for the same standard everywhere, when actually this might not be feasible.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming to this webinar. And then thank you so much, Professor Edmans, for your wonderful presentation.